Hi everyone. In this lecture, we will do a general overview of the theories of crime. So we've always had crime among us, and there have always been explanations for why people do the things that they do, since the beginning of time. So we'll first start with traditional explanations. And traditional explanations focused on spiritual or natural explanations. So they were rooted in religion or superstitions. So, for example, crime was against nature or the natural order of things. So, traditional explanations believed that there was this ongoing war between good and evil, and what happened was a criminal then succumbed to this evil. And even victims of crime weren't blameless in this school of thought. They were also viewed in this light, so they were thought to be receiving retributions for something that they had did in the past, sort of like the idea of karma. So victims were receiving some type of this divine retribution for something they did, and so basically the belief at this time, of course, really has to do with this difference between good and evil, and the fact that evil is associated with crime. And they were always focusing on the individual behavior. So it was the person themselves that was evil. The victim deserved what they received. And so therefore there was this thought to be some sort of this natural balance in the world. And another way in which someone could become criminal was through this idea of demonic possession. So it wasn't really, them. It was some force outside of them that had possessed them and, made them do this and made them commit this crime. And it was this focus on the individual here. So, well, if you believe that crime is, sort of based on spirituality or evil or whatever, one of the best ways to determine someone's guilt or innocence is through this idea of trial by ordeal. And what that means is basically the best way to test someone's guilt, if it's divine, is to put them to the test. And, if they're innocent, then God will save them. So you have these ordeals that people were put through in order to test their innocence. So for example, in this picture right here, you can see that, they're taking the suspect and essentially dumping them into the river. And they'll leave them there for 5-10 minutes and then pull them out. And if they were dead, then they were obviously guilty. And if they were alive, then they were not guilty because God saved them. Or you can, ask someone to walk around with this red hot poker, and if their hands burn, then they're guilty, and if they don't burn, then they're innocent. So certainly, there were very few innocent people back then. If you could guess, most people dunked in the water for 10 minutes, came up dead. So let's fast forward a bit here to the classical school. So no really developed theories of crime and criminality came out until about the 18th century. And there was this movement in Europe and American philosophy to look at crime in a different way. And this was known as the classical school. And the classical school came out of a period of enlightenment. There's optimism in the world, a sense of how good people could be. A lot of philosophers at the time were thinking about the potential of humankind, in this positive way. But this enlightenment was also tempered by a realistic recognition of the sad state of human affairs at the time, and there was this, need for major reform. So in the classical school, crime was explained as a particular individual form of evil. So it was as a moral wrongdoing that was fed by personal choice. So in other words, in this school of thought, the criminal chooses to do wrong. So now that doesn't mean that, they don't have other ideas about what might make someone choose to do wrong, but the central tenet here in this philosophy really revolved around this notion of free will. And so the principle of free will then is a really important part in deciding essentially to become a criminal in this school of thought. And they believed in some specific inherent rights and wrongs in the world. And all of us could identify as saying, you know, this thing is right and this thing is wrong. So they suggested that with the human condition, that we are all inherently good unless we choose to do wrong. So what are some of the major principles of the classical school? Well, the classical school talked a lot about how society provides to the individual. So if humans are inherently good, you know, what does the society or culture do for us? Well, it provides us benefits, you know, whether that be something like the economy, or, you know, you have hierarchies in place and you have a place to live and things like that. But in return, a society requires the forfeiture of some of these individual benefits. In other words, in order to live harmoniously together, some of your needs or wants, you know, might interfere with what society requires you to do at some point. So essentially, society requires you to do certain things as well. And what crime does is crime damages the quality of that bond between individuals and society. So you have certain rights and benefits from society, and in turn, society requires some type of action from you. But when you commit a crime, you damage that bond between yourself and your society. So those are the major tenets of the classical school. Two people that are very much associated with the classical school, we have Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. And they were two philosophers that had a huge impact on our views of criminality. And they each wrote a book about this topic. And you can look at these dates here, you know, and think about maybe what's going on in history around this time. You know, this is 1964, and we have Beccaria's essay on crime and punishment. And then in 1989, we have Bentham's Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. And these were both very widely read. And so the major proposals from these two classical theorists were that, one, punishment should be swift. So in order to have the greatest deterrence, you should have the punishment come soon after the discretion or the crime. And they also argued that there was no justification for severe punishment. So there's no justification for cruel punishment, you know, that people cannot really respond to cruel punishment. So if it doesn't teach them anything, then there was no justification for it. Also, they argued that punishment should fit the crime. You know, so more severe the crime, the more severe the punishment should be. If you make a small discretion, then it should only be a small punishment. They also argued that people should be treated with due process. So this is the idea that people need to know what the process is when they are accused of a crime. So there has to be a process in place, and people also need to know what that process is. And if they know it, then they're more likely to follow the law, is the idea. And lastly, you can't have law if people don't know what the law is. So they stated that the law should be widely known. So these are the major principles you saw from Beccaria and Bentham. And as I mentioned, you know, if you looked at those dates, you know, at that time we were going to assert our independence from England, and the Revolutionary War will come about. And so the framers of our Constitution, you know, were fully aware of the work of these two men. And in fact, many of our Bill of Rights really come directly from the classical school of criminology. So for example, the right to a public trial is something that they both talked about extensively in their works. The right to be judged by your peers. You know, this is our jury system. And this was greatly influenced by these classical criminologists. We also have the right against unusual punishment. Again, you know, right there in our Bill of Rights. And also the right to a speedy trial. All of these notions come directly from these classical criminologists and this classical school of thought. So you could say that, you know, our US Constitution and our Bill of Rights was heavily influenced by the classical school. Next, we have the positivist school. So about 100 years later, another school of thought came about. And as I mentioned, this was called the positivist school. And so one of the main pushes of the positivist school was to use the scientific method to study crime. Which sounds good, right? And can sound like a positive move. But if you really think about our scientific methods at that time, they were really pretty crude, and some of the theories that these positivists came up with do not hold up today. But the intention behind it was good. You know, this intention to use science to try to study crime. So they thought that behavior, especially criminality, was a function of two things. One is external forces that are beyond the control of the individual. And then two are internal forces. So things such as mental capabilities and biological makeup. And so those are the two main pieces of their theory. And it sounds pretty good in theory, but in practice, there were some pretty unusual and really distasteful theorists that came out of the positivist school here. So if you think about exactly what they're saying here, you know, while the classical folks were talking about free will and decision and the criminal deciding and choosing, the positivist school really focuses on things that the individual does not have control over. You know, things like your biology, something that you're born with, or these external forces that you have no control over. So it really takes the free will away from the criminal in this school of thought. And so we have Cesare Lombroso here, and he is probably one of the more famous individuals associated with this school of thought. And he was an Italian criminologist, and he was also the founder of the Italian school of positivist criminology. And he was influenced by three people. First, we have Darwin, who you're probably the most familiar with. And so as you know, Darwin was talking about things like social selection and evolution. Then we have Lavater. And he was an individual who studied what's known as physiognomy. I don't know if that's how you say that, and you will not need to know that. But essentially, what that study did is it assessed a person's outer appearance, so primarily their face. And this was in order to determine something about their inner characteristics. So essentially, by looking at facial features, you could tell something about this person's personality and whether or not they were likely to be a criminal. And then you have Francis Gall, and he proposed the theory of phrenology, which he suggests basically that the shape and the bumps and the fissures on one's skull and head can be used to map out your personality and also your likelihood of committing crime. So by massaging your head, he could feel these bumps and fissures and suggest whether or not you were a criminal. So Lombroso is really using these three very biologically based theorists to discuss criminality. And then in 1861, he wrote a very influential paper called On Criminal Man, in which he discussed these types of ideas. And he suggests that criminals have a very unique physical type, and that you can recognize them through this physical type. And so he suggested that there are four classes of criminals. First, you have the born, or the atavists. And he spent most of his time studying these criminals because he claimed that these were the types that you could, spot by just looking at their facial features. And he called them evolutionary degenerates. So, this terminology doesn't really suggest that we're thinking about these criminals, as someone who made a mistake or someone who chose to commit a crime because of some external sources or reasons that could be rehabilitated. This terminology really suggests that this is something innate and that this person is a degenerate by evolutionary standards. And then the second was what he called the insane. And this basically were individuals that, which he suggested, had mental illness, and this mental illness causes this criminality in them. And then third, he had the occasional. So he suggested that sometimes, these are people who sometimes occasionally commit crime for personal gain, but he didn't really talk about these individuals as much. And finally, he talked about the passionate criminal. And these were individuals that were, pushed by passion to do something that they usually wouldn't do. So because of something that happened, their anger was inflamed, and because of this, they committed a crime. And so here you have a very different way of looking at criminality than the classical school. The positivist school gave rise to some very interesting and maybe some disturbing biological theories that came about in the late 19th and early 20th century. And we'll spend some more time talking about these biological theories of crime. So we'll record a separate lecture on some of these biological theories. But I just wanted to introduce you to these two big schools of thought in criminology, the classical school and the positivist school, and show you, how differently they view human beings and crime.